Good afternoon, DEC members and guests. I'm Steve Gregorian, President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Club, coming to you from lovely downtown Detroit. Welcome to our always popular annual Michigan Economic Outlook meeting. We had hoped to do this one in person, but appreciate your flexibility as we take this 100% virtual. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. I always want to take a brief moment to thank the terrific DEC sponsors for their continued support of our mission, and you're seeing them on your screen. And I want to thank you for continuing to support the DEC with your membership. On a programming note, for the next few months, we've got a ton of virtual meetings for you. Plenty on the calendar, so be sure to check them out on our website. There is something for everyone, and we're always adding more. You already know, if you've been with us before, how important it is to the DEC that high school and college students are included. And today we want to say welcome to students from Advanced Technology Academy, U of D Jesuit High School, and Schoolcraft College. We're really happy you've joined us today. The DEC has an incredible history of speakers, and our speakers today joined a distinguished list of 11 others who, in our 88-year history, have addressed the DEC on this day, January 13th. And that eclectic list begins with a speaker way back in 1936 and also includes Professor Leo Wollman in 1947. And I bring him up because his speech titled that day parallels, interestingly enough, what's going on today. His speech title back then, 1947, was "The Rising Spiral of Higher Wages and Higher Prices." And in 1998, the DEC hosted Reverend Jesse Jackson, and most recently in 2020, media mogul Steve Forbes. And today we're really pleased to add Elaine Buckberg and Quentin Messer as our 12th speakers on this day in DEC history. And now on to our meeting. Here's the format for today. We're going to unveil first some survey results, and then ask our panel to discuss those results and their outlook for Michigan's economy in 2022. And for the final portion, we're going to get to your questions that you can submit via the QA function, not the chat box at this one. Please use the Q&A box, and we're going to get to those in the final 15 minutes. And so introduce our roundtable. I'm going to call on DEC board member Jason Tinsley. Jason is the managing director for JP Morgan Private Bank here in Michigan. He's a good friend, good to me, a good friend to the DEC. So hello to Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, DEC members and guests, and Happy New Year. It is my privilege to introduce today's roundtable. First, Dr. Elaine Buckberg, who is the chief economist of General Motors. She's responsible for assessing the impact of worldwide economic developments on the corporation and for providing advice to top leadership on various competitive and economic policy issues. Now, prior to joining GM, Elaine worked at the Brattle Group, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Economic Policy, and the IMF and Morgan Stanley. Elaine holds a PhD in economics from MIT and a BA in economics and English from Yale, and is a DEC member. We're so glad to have her here today. Next, we have Quentin Messer Jr. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the MEDC and the President and Chair of the Michigan Strategic Fund. Messer is charged with implementing and executing MEDC's core mission of the business development and attraction, community development, and providing access to capital and enhancing Michigan's image and brand with a focus on building a strong and equitable economy for all Michiganders. Now, prior to joining MEDC last summer, Quentin led the New Orleans Business Alliance and also has worked at the Boston Consulting Group and O'Melveny and Myers LLP, and a variety of startup ventures as well. Messer received a BA from Princeton University and earned his JD and MBA from Columbia University. We welcome Quentin to Michigan. And now also, our moderator today is a familiar face to all, Daniel House, senior editor and business columnist for the Detroit News. He's a frequent contributor to News Talk 760 WJR in Detroit and a weekly contributor to Michigan Radio in Ann Arbor. Daniel holds a bachelor's degree in history from the College of Wooster in Ohio and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. I'll tell you what, the Ivy League is well represented with us on this call today. So on behalf of our virtual DC guests and members, we welcome the three of you today. Now, this past November and December, many of you, including myself, participated in the 10th annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. The survey was authored by the Baker Strategy Group in partnership with the CFI Group. Here to unveil some key survey results is Baker Strategy Managing Director, David Baker. David, take it away.
We are delighted to be here today to release the results of the 10th annual Michigan Economic Outlook Survey. We will go through this quickly so we can hear from our panel. The engine of our economy is the private sector, so this program has one central theme: to make Michigan a great place to grow a business. Special thanks are due to Steve Gregorian and the Detroit Economic Club for a tremendous response from members, as well as to Diane Keller of the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti Chamber. Thanks also to Sherry Petrus, David Ham, Don Hart, Jimmy Shao, Matt Brown, and Larry Eiler, who have all volunteered time to this effort over the past decade. Michigan has 10 million people with a labor force of 4.8 million, 4.5 million of whom are employed, giving Michigan a 5.9% unemployment rate, at least at this point. Our GDP is $567 billion, putting per capita GDP at around $56.7. Michigan's workforce of that 4.5 million breaks down to 79% business, 9% nonprofit, and 12% government. Our survey generally reflects these demographics, though we do tend to slightly overrepresent nonprofits and underrepresent government employees. Survey participants work in areas across Michigan, with the most responses coming from the lower half of the Lower Peninsula. For timing, the survey always begins 1 week after Election Day, which this year was November 2nd. So the survey ran November 9th to December 17th, with results officially released today, January 13th. And for measurement, we borrow an approach used by Ann Arbor-based consulting firm CFI Group, co-founder of the American Customer Satisfaction Index. CFI Group asks questions on a 1 to 10 scale for greater measurement precision, then translates the results to 0 to 100 to generate a score. These scores are what we use to report results today. Generally, you want scores to be in the high 70s or low 80s. Okay, on to the results. Our survey looks at 4 levels: individual organization performance, the local community, the regional economy, and Michigan overall. We'll look at organization performance first. The 12-month organization outlook bounced back after dropping dramatically last year. It's a good indicator that people feel we're past the COVID nadir. The 6-month, 12-month, and 3-year outlooks generally move together, and in 2020, all 3 were actually at 80. Then the pandemic hit, with lockdowns and a stymied economy. The short-term 6-month and 12-month outlooks dropped, but the longer-term 3-year outlook remained stable. In 2022, we do see a recovery of optimism, with the 6-month and 12-month outlooks recovering partway back to pre-COVID levels. Last year, 67% were negatively impacted by COVID, resulting in the low 66 for the 12-month outlook. This year, just 35% are negatively impacted, and even those negatively impacted have a 12-month outlook that is 5 points higher than the 66 of last year. This uncertainty is causing strain in organizational performance. Scores dropped across the board, but especially for adapting to changes in the marketplace and having a clear direction for the future, both down 6 points from last year. Organizations are struggling to navigate these uncertain economic times. Local community. Local communities continue to be generally lukewarm in K-12 schools, support for entrepreneurs, and available talent. Regional economy. The Michigan economy is made up of economic regions that are very different from one another. The framework we like to use to understand these economic regions is the Michigan Prosperity Regions model developed by the MEDC. In 2022, Michigan respondents are a little less likely to recommend their region as a great place to grow a business, down another 3 points to 75 and setting a new 6-year low. 2 measures stand out here. First, we see a surprising jump in availability of skilled, educated talent available for hire. Efforts to build up Michigan's talent pool seem to be working. In 2021, for example, the Michigan Going Pro Talent Fund gave over 1,000 awards totaling over $40 million to companies to train almost 30,000 workers in a new skill. Programs like this appear to be having an impact. On the other hand, Quality of life drops 6 points to a low 68. Clearly, the pandemic and related restrictions have contributed to this drop. Michigan overall. The score for recommending Michigan as a great place to grow a business edged up 3 points. We expect this upward trend to continue in 2023. Michigan moves up 6 points to 67 for being business friendly and up 5 points to 64 for being on the right track. Still a concern, though, is the 5-point drop for being a great state to raise a family. Michigan needs to be a great place both for families and young professionals for us to continue our economic growth in the state. Thank you, and now back to the inimitable Daniel Howes and our two esteemed panelists for their insights.
Thanks very much, David. Welcome, everybody. I'm curious, I'd like to start with just kind of getting Elaine and Quentin's reaction to the survey results. It strikes me that obviously 2018 was a high watermark, and that was a very different time given everything we've gone through both politically, economically, and epidemiologically. Elaine, what's your take on the results?
So it's not surprising that we haven't seen a full recovery of sentiment about anything about business yet. And if you look at consumer confidence and business confidence measures, in general, they haven't fully recovered. It's been a very complex pandemic. And even as we've developed vaccination and done better with each successive wave of the virus, there have been a lot of challenges in navigating and recovering from the pandemic, including for businesses, as we've been hit by a wide range of challenges that I'm sure we'll discuss further, from supply chain issues, freight issues, inflation issues. So the fact that things have gotten on a better level from last year, but not as high as they were pre-pandemic, I expect will continue to improve.
Do you see uncertainty, and do you see concern implicit in the numbers, kind of uncertainty within business because of what you're just talking about, is that we don't know that there's not another variant that's going to come out of some other part of the world and we're going to have it on our doorstep again. And it's going to be different than Omicron, which was different than Delta.
There have been a lot of challenges, and while I'm optimistic about the outlook, so the National Survey of Economic Forecasters has GDP growth forecast for 22 at 3.9%. I think even if we have a slowdown in January and February, a slowdown in growth, not a total deceleration of the economy, we can easily hit that this year. So and that's twice pre-pandemic growth rates. But it's still a bumpy road. There have been a lot of surprises. Omicron is causing lots of absenteeism across the economy. That's disrupting everything from schools to hospitals to the number of people to deliver goods and put them on the shelves. So it's still a complex situation. I'm hoping that the freight situation that affects a lot of our supply chain and prices will improve, but Omicron could slow that progress. So it's a bumpy road, but it's going in the right direction.
Quentin, what do you see in the results of the survey?
Thank you for the question. Honored to be here. I see three big picture things. I see one, what distinguishes Michigan from a lot of other places, a fundamental core belief in Michigan as a place of the possible. Two, I do feel I see fatigue. I think Elaine mentioned it. This has taken longer than anyone anticipated. There are mental health consequences. There are, as Elaine alluded to, supply chain, labor shortages. It's been an overused term, but unprecedented. So I think you see fatigue. And I think the final point you see is business success, or any business leader would tell you, even if I don't like the answer, I need the predictability of the process by which you got to that answer.
Right.
And what we've experienced the last few months has thrown all that into question, because we're all dealing with, except those that were around in 1918 or so, with something that there is no pattern recognition. And when there is no pattern recognition, from a policy perspective, from just any perspective, is difficult to provide that type of predictability. And I think you saw that in the survey results.
I'm wondering, and this will come up several times, but I'm wondering to what extent we think that some of these changes in the workplace and the changing nature of work are permanent, that we've lived with these kind of adjustments I know we talk about it in our newsroom. We're still running the newspaper virtually. And you talk about going back to the newsroom, a lot of people are like, well, why? So, and I know General Motors has addressed that, talking about work appropriately. You've got a policy, but do you think a lot of this is permanent, a lot of these changes?
I think there are going to be lasting changes, but maybe not the way we are today. So starting with how we work, I don't think people who are not now, because the nature of their job allows some remote component, who are not back in the office, they're probably not going to go back 40 hours a week. But they're probably not going to be as remote as they are now in the future. When we're in an environment where it makes sense to say, be in the office and you don't need to wear a mask, that will change the amount of time. There's something irreplaceable about being in person. I wish conditions let us be in person today. But I think there will be some persistence, but where we are today is not the new permanent future.
You agree?
And that also is just one more thing. I mean, in terms of Michigan
Yeah.
being a great place, like we have lots of great outdoors. So in this period where one of the things people have done is spend less time in theaters and nightclubs and bars, Michigan's great outdoors has been a terrific place to be and to live. I think people will spend more time doing those things for a long time in the future, even if not as much so as today.
Yeah, and if you go up to the UP in the summer, it can be a total zoo because of exactly what you're saying. I mean, some of these places are overrun. Quentin, do you have anything to add?
I absolutely agree. I think the one thing I will flag, though, is the hybrid nature of work, and I absolutely agree with everything Elaine said. The one thing that we need to think about is the impact on training young folks. And one of the survey result points was the fact that the decline in sentiment about Michigan is a great place for young people. So it's going to be important for us to figure out how do we help acculturate younger professionals or younger skills, trade men and women. And we have to figure out that in this hybrid workplace. But I do think that's one, if I could use the term, casualty of this way, because so much of what you learn is by just bumping into somebody or being able to sort of through osmosis see how a more senior person handles and those incidental things. So that's the only thing I would flag.
I completely agree. There's so much that's learned by watching and through the, oh, well, I can slip in a question when you're getting coffee or you're passing my desk or I'm passing yours. That's a much lower barrier to a conversation than when you have to IM someone to see if you can call them.
One of the big forces we're dealing with right now that a lot of us have really never dealt with in our adult lives is kind of rampant inflation. Just today, the cover of the New York Times, the Detroit News, the Wall Street Journal, highest in 40 years in inflation. We've got a chart that we pulled out of the Washington Post yesterday. I pulled it off the wire yesterday. Gasoline up 58%, used cars and trucks up 31%, meats, poultry, and fish up 13.1%, new vehicles 11.1%, motor vehicle parts and equipment up 10.2%. We've got a chief economist here, so we have to ask, what does all this mean going forward for the economy, for the economic outlook, jobs, consumer behavior, business investment, and expansion?
There's no question that inflation is extremely high. So yesterday's reading for December was 7% year over year inflation on the headline number. So versus December of 2020 and 5.5% core inflation, which strips out the volatile food and energy components. So there's no question inflation's too high and it's the biggest cloud on the horizon. The single most important thing in resolving that in my view, is easing in supply chain bottlenecks. Now, the rapid run-up in consumer prices in the last 9 months is a combination of very strong demand, obviously a good thing, but also broad supply shortages. And that includes global energy stores. So your first 4 categories here are all energy components. And you should know that in the December data, if you look month over month, energy pretty much across the board came down in price, as did food prices. And when I look at the month over month data, which is really where I look at what's the momentum in inflation, the headline number came down by about a third in the month over month in inflation, and core inflation was essentially flat. So that's encouraging, actually. I don't think the data got much worse in December. So turning to this easing of supply bottlenecks, well, we're seeing some improvements, first of all. So freight prices, especially ocean freight, have come down from some record highs. And I think that'll continue to improve, although the pace may get slowed by disruptions due to Omicron. And your fourth item here, or the fifth item, is new and used vehicle prices, which has been a really big contributor to inflation. So in December, vehicle prices were 37% of core inflation, or inflation other than food and energy. New vehicle prices are up 12% year over year. Used vehicle prices are up 38% year over year. And so largely driven by used vehicles, but those two markets are closely linked. The good news is that we've got better chip supply in the auto supply chain. GM is normalizing production. All of our plants are operating on normal schedules with a single exception. We're adding a few shifts at some plants. We're doing overtime. And when I look at other automakers, I'm only aware of one automaker that's taking much downtime this month. So that means more vehicles coming through, and we should see those prices moderate and help. So the way I see inflation, I see easing over the course of the year. The consensus forecast says inflation will be about 4.6% year over year. That means we get under 3% by the end of the year. I still think that's a reasonable forecast, but I'm mindful of risks this outlook. So there is the risk that there's some feedback between prices and wages that would slow progress, and Omicron could slow progress in the near term, but I really do think that we are on a path towards lower inflation. We just have to, but we're gonna get through a few more months where we're gonna have high numbers.
Do you see this as having any impact on jobs, hiring, expansion at this point?
You know, at this point in the labor market, there is excess demand for labor versus supply.
Right.
So nationally, there are 11 jobs for 6 people seeking work. It's actually even higher in Michigan. In terms of the labor market, the December jobs report said nationally unemployment came down to 3.9%. From a peak of nearly 15% and from 3.5% before the crisis began, which was a historic low. One of the biggest holdbacks to the labor market right now is there are a lot of people who were working before who are still sitting on the sidelines outside of the labor force that need to be drawn back in. Some of those people have had trouble getting childcare. Some are concerned about COVID risk. Some of them have said they retired earlier. And frankly, we've had a lot less immigration over this period. However, I do expect that we'll see continued healing in the labor market. And frankly, this shortage of workers in relation to hiring means that wages have gone up, especially at the entry level, which means that people on the sidelines should find it increasingly attractive to come back in. It's worth saying that Michigan's situation is somewhat more challenging. And Michigan has the November data, the latest we have for state, is 5.9% unemployment versus 3.9% in December nationally. We have further to go. The payrolls have come back. There's still about a 5% gap to payrolls versus a 3% gap nationally. So we've got further to go, but this is also a great opportunity to draw people who have been out of the labor force back in.
Quentin, you're the guy in the arena when it comes to business recruitment, clearly, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. But I'm curious as to whether you think the inflation that Elaine's talking, does that complicate in any way some of your business recruitment efforts?
It complicates it because it affects businesses of all sizes, and I think as companies try to project out. Whether it's the capital expense, whether it's the expense of construction materials, but I think it's also the labor. What will it take in order for us to, our companies to sort of bring labor back or improve the labor force participation rate? The one thing I would say, and I will have to defer to Elaine on this, is that particularly for small and medium-sized businesses who may not be able to pass on additional costs to consumers, you saw this, one-time bonuses or entry salaries going up tremendously. And how does that, there was then compression with people who have been more experienced. Once we get past this period, then what happens long term? Do you still see those accelerations? So yes, that does complicate it, but we have one of the most robust pipelines I've ever seen in my career. Here in Michigan, we're competing hard, we're competing aggressively. I know we'll talk about that later, but it's nothing that can't be solved, in short.
Well, it's kind of an interesting, sorry about that, spam, interesting confluence of issues here where you've got more demand for labor than you have supply. And I just wonder to what extent the attitudes of a business have changed, what competitiveness has changed, and what you've kind of learned coming through this pandemic. Have you seen a different set of, it used to be that business was always attracted by low taxes, low utility rates, ample land. Something tells me that it's a lot more than that. I'd be interested to hear both of you riff on that, because I think we know Michigan. I think at least we've reported that Detroit News is in the hunt for some big projects potentially, and I know there are others on the horizon. And I'm just kind of curious as to what extent the pandemic maybe has changed the view of business in terms of what defines competitive.
Elaine, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
I don't know that it's changed. I mean, there are near-term issues like recruitment. The pandemic and more hybrid and virtual work may involve a more national labor market, which means both that companies in Michigan can recruit more people from outside of Michigan, and companies outside of Michigan can recruit people from Michigan who say, hey, I can have like a big house at a reasonable price and public schooling and some great state universities. So I don't think it changes the general objective function that much in the near term. Perhaps more slack in the Michigan labor market would be an advantage for a company that's deciding whether or not to set up in Michigan or outside. And for a company like General Motors in manufacturing, this is a state with a great manufacturing tradition where those jobs and goods production are appreciated and valued, and families have long traditions. We have more plants here than anywhere else. We have invested heavily and expect to continue to do so.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is maybe 3 points. One is I do think that, Daniel, in addition to the factors, taxes, utility rates, and I think that we have done quite a bit of work here in Michigan on that factor. And land, I do think talent, accessibility, you hear a lot about day one talent. Day one. And I think I think that's sort of an additional add-on. I think a second one is just speed. Given the pace of technological change, given, and Elaine can talk, with great expertise on what is happening in the passenger vehicle space and as we transition propulsion systems. What we are seeing, though, is that acceleration, that velocity of change is forcing companies to place big bets. And those companies, the big bets by GM, will have positive, hopefully, externalities for small and medium-sized businesses. Not just the direct suppliers, but the sandwich shop, the restaurant, the haberdasher, the whoever, because you have smart people who have cash coming into your city or state, or retrenching there. And the absolute last thing is we should never lose perspective. Michigan has what so many other states and provinces crave. we have a proven, sophisticated, advanced manufacturing base that has very rich supply chains. And it's not just automotive, which is incredibly important, particularly this part of the state. But as I think about all 83 counties in this great state, forestry, for example, agribusiness, we have opportunities in the life sciences and medical devices and other segments. So Michigan's ability to be dominant in industries for robust supply chain makes us very enviable, an enviable spot for a lot of states and provinces.
Well, that raises a point. You have about Michigan's manufacturing and GM's footprint, as well as Ford and others. My understanding of the way this works is there is a relationship between where vehicles are built and assembled and where the coming wave of battery producing plants is likely to be. And a lot of that has to do with transportation. Does that mean that Michigan is likely to be a winner in this race to land its share or more than of battery assembly operations?
So Michigan is the home to three huge automakers, right? To GM,
Right.
to Ford, and Stellantis. We all have lots of plants here. And our head of manufacturing, Gerald Johnson, made a pretty passionate and compelling speech at our recent investor day about the advantage of having plants versus doing greenfield plants.
Right.
In terms of growth in EVs. So keep that all in mind. Our first two battery plants that we've announced, and the first two of, I assure you, are many, are in Lordstown, Ohio and Spring Hill, Tennessee. They'll have a combined capacity of 70 gigawatt hours, but we're planning to add 2 additional plants in the US by mid-decade and perhaps more. That'll double our capacity. And Michigan is definitely under consideration, and we'd be very proud to invest in our home state.
Yes, I
have
know
no
that.
break today.
I can ask the question. I mean, I've got 2 people here, both of whom coming from different directions ought to know. I mean, at least our reporting seems to point to the fact that Delta Township is likely to be a site for a battery plant. Are you in a position to be able to confirm that?
I'm not going to break any news for you today, Dan. Sorry.
How about you, Quentin? Can I get you to turn on this?
We in Michigan are fighting hard and being competitive to earn the continued investment from GM. And we're going to do whatever it takes to earn that. And we've got work to do. We're committed to getting that done.
Do you feel? Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me just highlight a couple investments, though. I mean, we're certainly on the steady track record, right? We invested $2.2 billion to completely remake our Detroit Hamtramck plant to factory zero. So our first big truck and SUV plant right here in Detroit, in addition to Lake Orion, we started producing the Hummer, and thank you to President Biden for coming to open it. We've announced a battery lab, our Advanced Battery Cell Innovation Center in Warren. And of course, our first EV plant is Orion Assembly. So we're clearly have a track record of investing in EV in this state with 2 plants here.
So to tell the skeptics on our call today, why this pivot to electrification by GM and frankly, most other players of the legacy automakers is for real.
So we absolutely believe in a future of zero emissions, but let me tell you why, right? The technologies are here. The customers are getting ready. The infrastructure is coming out. So we plan, first of all, I think there is a backward looking perception sometimes that EVs are small, low range, and don't fit everyone's needs, but that's coming to the market. As battery costs have gone down and we can put larger batteries and put more range in every vehicle, we and other automakers as well are able to offer a full range. So when we say we want to build an EV for everybody, we mean whether you want a crossover, a truck, or an SUV, like a Hummer truck pickup, for example, or a sedan, we're going to have it for you. We're going to have it across a wide range of price points. That continued progress in battery cost will help compress the ICE EV price differential. And if Congress passes the Build Back Better Act with the EV tax credit expansion for 10 years to 2031, that will help narrow that price differential and advance the tipping point. And our market research and independent third-party research shows a very rapidly shifting interest in EVs. And so, I mean, in our own research, we see it quarter to quarter, but Consumer Reports and Ipsos have both done surveys that say drivers today, a third of them are ready to consider an EV for their next purchase. 70% are ready to consider one.
I think you kind of saw that in Mary Barra's announcements at CES, and they're focusing on the work for the Silverado. I mean, it's
companies are absolutely eager to do it. They're eager to have a greener footprint. Honestly, our fleet people tell me they can't get enough, are fighting with our retail people for long-term future orders.
Well, and when you think about it, I've talked with their team about this. When you think about it, I mean, large businesses are the obvious customer, because they have the ability to build mass charging stations for their own fleets, where the vehicles come in, charge at night, people come in the next morning, take the trucks out, do 120 miles of routes or whatever they do, come back. It fits, and it also puts it out into the marketplace.
It's even more than that, though. Businesses are more rational decision makers. They're going to sit there and do the discounted cash flow spreadsheet to see that their savings on cost of ownership will outweigh the price differential and how many years it'll take to amortize that. And in addition, every public company and also a lot of private companies are dealing with investors who are pushing us hard on ESG, environmental, social, and governance.
Right.
It's pushing the whole corporate sector to have ambitious goals, although honestly, Mary Barra is the #1 advocate and has been for years at GM. So that's very internally generated. And companies want to have both, lower long-term costs of ownership and to be able to project that better environmental footprint.
Two questions, one for each of you. Quentin, for you, what are battery investors I say battery investors, people that are companies that are investing in battery plants, what are the things that they're looking for? We did some reporting when Ford was down in Tennessee and Kentucky, and one of the first things they told us was low utility rates because of the high energy consumption of those kinds of operations. And for Elaine, I'm interested in what the downsides to electrification are. I mean, we have 100 years of an auto industry in this state. There's been a lot of culture and a lot of things. I mean, there's been a lot of change, no question about it. But there are concerns about job losses on the factory floor. Different companies are approaching that different ways. So I'd be interested in you both kind of, biting off your separate pieces of this. Quentin?
Yeah, sure. So you asked two components to the question. I think as Elaine mentioned, that companies are still sort of seeking what they always sought, but these are incredibly energy intensive industries. Michigan has been a home of a lot of energy intensive industries. We have great partners in our utilities. DTE, I'll be remiss if I didn't mention them, since we're talking to the Detroit Economic Club, have been very aggressive. We've come alongside them. I've learned from them, and they are pushing hard. They have had a rate case that passed that is going to be very favorable. It's going to be favorable for industry intensive industries, but it's not going to also put that on the back of residential. So I think that's a great opportunity. But to your broader point, Daniel, I think it's an important one. Look, economic development only matters to the extent that people matter. And what keeps me up at night, and what I'm charged by the MEDC Executive Committee, when I'm charged by legislative leaders, when I'm charged by Governor Whitmer, is, did you think about how this affects 10 million plus Michiganders? And we just look at numbers. Numbers don't lie. There are fewer components in a electric propelled vehicle than in an ICE. ICE isn't going to fully go away. We have to work very hard and make sure, as part of our overall de-risking project investments, in order to be competitive, that we think about ways for talent to retrain people and prepare them. It just sets up new opportunities. Maybe not directly working in the auto industry, but in adjacent verticals that can take advantage of their skill set. But one of the things that we have to do is continue to understand that perception lags reality. And this is the only thing before I turn it back over to Elaine. I'm new to Michigan. I am humbled to be here. I'm having a time in my life. I've fallen madly in love with Michigan. But there's one thing about Michiganders that I would change if I could. Too humble. Michigan has very much, it's a lunch pail mentality. Let the work speak for itself. I don't have to tell my story. I don't have to own the narrative. And back when I'm from in the South, there's a saying, it ain't bragging if it's true. And Michigan,
I've heard that before.
Michigan is innovation. And I'm a big sports fanatic, so I got to shout out Zeke, the great Isaiah Thomas from my wife's hometown, Chicago, once said that Michigan changed the world. He didn't use that language, he used more colorful language twice, the car and Motown. And I think we constantly have to remind ourselves and never lose perspective.
Right.
If you can design stuff and build stuff, you do not want to bet against Michigan.
That's right. And you've gone through a lot of hard times too, which builds character, I think. Elaine, just quickly, what comes to mind about downsides to electrification? We talked a little bit about jobs, and Quentin kind of got at that calculus. Anything else come to mind? And then I have one final one-sentence question for each of you.
So I wouldn't talk about downsides. I would say, though, that what we really need to achieve the transition is the EV infrastructure rollout. So we are targeting 50% EVs among our sales by 2030 and 0 emissions from light duty vehicles by 2035. So we think that EVs do replace ICE vehicles over time. And of course, those have to cycle through the used vehicles and be taken out of circulation. But the EV infrastructure rollout is critical. Many owners will be able to charge at home and avoid the gas station except on road trips. But there are people who live in apartments and won't be able to charge necessarily at home or at work. And so there needs to be charging in the community. And critically, there needs to be charging along highway corridors to make people confident that they can have an EV as their only vehicle and have an EV even if they don't live in a home where they can have home charging.
That's a lot to achieve. I can see why the industry is looking to the government for help, because that's a lot of infrastructure to deal with.
And the Biden administration and Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure bill approved $7.5 billion
Right.
to help fund that public charging infrastructure.
So as we look forward here, I want to ask each of you to give me one word. Are you optimistic about Michigan in this year and into the following year, economically speaking, or pessimistic? And then give us one sentence as to why. Elaine, you go first.
I am optimistic. Michigan is a state that takes on challenges well and knows how to work through them.
Quentin?
Absolutely optimistic. And I think the one sentence is Michigan still knows how to conceive, design, and build. And that is the essence of creativity and problem solving, which is a hallmark of capitalism.
Thank you, Elaine Buckberg and Quentin Messer from the MEDC. Jason, we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you all. What a presentation. So we do have questions that came in simultaneously as we were having a conversation. So I want to get to some of those, and there are a couple more that came in earlier. But I'm going to take this first one and maybe pass it. We'll go back globally and a little bit nationally from an economic standpoint. So Elaine, take this one. To what extent have the various stimulus measures contributed to inflation and reduced workforce participation?
Stimulus has done a couple of things. First of all, it helped fill the gap and create strong demand. Consumers spent more and built a war chest of savings. But honestly, I think inflation has, for the most part, been more driven by bottlenecks on the supply side, some of which go all the way back to the time when the economy was shut down. Think about it, in 2020, The auto industry took out about 24% of its production days, and demand fell only 15%. Much of the economy is is still catching up from things like that. In terms of employment and returning to work, the generosity of unemployment benefits after after vaccines were in effect may have slowed return to work. And there's mixed evidence studying states that ended those unemployment benefits early and those that didn't. But they have not been there since Labor Day. And people are still slowly coming back to the workforce. So there seem to be other bottlenecks, like I can't get childcare because there are fewer daycare workers, or I'm concerned that my child's school will close. And so I'm hesitant to go back and take a full-time job. So we're still dealing with disruptions from the pandemic, but we are seeing steady progress in return to work, especially from those people who are on the sidelines. And we're seeing some moderation in the monthly pace of wage gains.
Okay.
So I think that's an improving front.
Thank you. Now, I want to focus on Michigan. This question came in about global trade, and I'll send it to you, Quentin. The Italian consulate asked the question of what must it take, or what can they do to better partner with the state of Michigan and MEDC to kind of move up the ranking as a trade partner? And, like, how can they better partner, and what steps should they take?
No, absolutely. I will provide my contact information, messerq@michigan.org. So messerq@michigan.org. We should talk, but seriously, 3 quick things. We need to make sure that we understand the needs of the Italian market. We need to continue the same things that we need to do in order to earn GM's investment. I would argue we need to do that to earn the right for Italian companies to invest here, and conversely for Michigan businesses to look to Italian companies in which to invest. The second thing we need to do is we have to be intentional. We can't be episodic in our conversations. And obviously, given the global interconnectivity of the automotive sector, the mobility sector, and other sectors, I think there's tremendous opportunities. But one, it just begins by having a conversation. Most things come by basically having a relationship, and I look forward to reaching out and speaking to the council.
Excellent. Thank you, Quentin. I'm going to go back to you, Elaine, and maybe just for perspective. We know the world has changed. GM is a tremendously large corporation, manufacturing sites all across the globe, and specifically in Michigan. But then Fed Chairman Powell mentioned that we're not going back to the previous pre-pandemic economy. One of the things that's changed is many of us are working from home, and that's going to be pretty much semi-permanent, or at least the flexibility is there to have that option. What are some of the other things that you're seeing as far as trends that are coming out of the pandemic that are going to be different than what we ever experienced before, and how should we adapt to it?
So there's some changes in how and where people work and live. And so one thing we've seen during the pandemic is that there's been a lot of movement out of the sort of urban cores of cities to suburbs and even to exurbs. And there's a lot more demand for single family homes, both to purchase them and to rent them. So single family homes is a huge contributor to inflation. And so I think, and people often want more space at home to work from home. And that's documented by research about remote workers that predates the pandemic. So I think we'll see some persistent changes in the geography of where people live. If they're commuting less often, and if there are somewhat fewer people on the road, they may be willing to drive further when they go to work because road speeds will be faster and they're just not doing it as often. And we'll see some changes also in the geography of where businesses are. So for example, there might be fewer lunch places downtown and more lunch places in suburbs where people might go get lunch or coffee when they're working from home and need a little stimulation during the day. So there'll be some geographic change.
Okay, so you're thinking of a shift to or migration, not just away from large urban areas, but maybe creating smaller communities that'll expand in the outer rings, and then people will have to choose between going into the office or back and forth or just working from home.
Right. And we've literally seen that. Like in cities, there are more vacancies of storefront real estate, and there are more new businesses selling lunch and coffee in the suburbs around the country.
Yeah. So Quentin, I'll ask you this question again. Welcome to Michigan. And I think you might have enjoyed your first 6-degree day, which is earlier this week. And I didn't say 60, I said 6. So what you're charged with is kind of reshaping how people see this great state. Are we doing enough to recruit talent to the state? Part one. And part two, are there policies that the congressional seats in Michigan can do to help you with that?
So two great questions. One, I think the answer is an unqualified yes. Michigan's doing enough to attract young people, because if you look at University of Michigan, I think had a record enrollment. Some of the other universities were off, but I mean, Wayne State, UD Mercy, they are national and regional draws that bring young people all over the country. What we have to do is continue to earn that trust and we have to re-recruit, in essence, young people. And one of the things that we have to do better, I always believe, I'm a big sports fanatic, if you don't have that perfect season, you can always get better. And one of the things we have to get better about is connecting with the career service offices at our 2-year, 4-year university, both public and private, and help young people understand that there are the same opportunities that you perceive happen on the coast. They got them right here in Michigan. They have them right here. It can't get more technologically sophisticated than going to work for GM. It can't get more financially rigorous than going to work for JP Morgan Chase. You can't talk about anything when it comes to the most innovative techniques when it comes to mortgages and securitizations and things of that nature. You look at Rocket or Matt Ispa's company. I mean, we can go on and on and on. I don't want to call the roll because I will forget somebody, but the point is we have to constantly re-earn that. It's almost like we now live in a perpetual transfer portal, to bring it to a college sports analogy. You have to constantly tell the story. So what are we doing from a policy perspective? There are programs, the governor, Futures for Frontliners, 60 by 30, to make sure that by year 2030, 60% of Michiganders who had some form of college had credentials, providing opportunities for frontline workers to go back to college. We have to expand those. We have to be much more aggressive and find flexible funding dollars, partnering with our private sector, partnering with our philanthropic sector to constantly think about how do we create a state of lifelong learners. And that's the challenge. And I think when we do that, we will earn the young people who can say, I can see my entire career trajectory here in this great state of Michigan.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. And again, thank you all for this esteemed panel today. It's been a pleasure to work with you and keep the train on track and keep it running. Wish we were in person, but this time we have 5 minutes left. I'm gonna pass it back to Steve to close us out. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Jason. And I love the Isaiah Thomas quote that Quentin used. It ain't bragging if it's true. Well, let me brag on you all because you are terrific. It's really, really true. So a huge thank you to Elaine, Quentin, Daniel, David Baker for a truly informative session. And Jason Tinsley, really good job by you presiding over this. And we really hope to have you all with us again in person one day soon. In fact, I'm getting texts and you're seeing some chats. The people love this session. They want you to come back. So maybe a year from now, we can do this again in person sometime. And to Quentin, I love your Detroit Tigers tie. It reminds me we're just 5 weeks away from spring training. So that gives me some hope on a cold, cloudy Michigan day. So thank you again to all of you. For DEC members, be sure to get your free tickets to the many, many upcoming January and February virtual events. Finish the week strong, stay healthy. I know some of you have 1 o'clock meetings, so on time, every time. This meeting of the Detroit Economic Club is now adjourned. Goodbye, everybody.